You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Celine Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Hello, strong, feisty women. I hope you all are well. It is time for another show on hormones. But this time, we're not talking estrogen or progesterone or even testosterone. We are talking about one of the most misunderstood and wrongfully maligned hormones coursing through our veins, cortisol. That somewhat infamous stress hormone that gets blamed for excess belly fat and high blood sugar and accelerated aging and a host of other menopausal and midlife woes. The conversation around cortisol has gotten so out of control that we hear from menopausal and midlife women who are actually afraid to exercise or exercise too much because they've been told it will raise their cortisol, which, and this is true, can already be elevated during this time of life. The problem with this narrative is that it's completely one-sided. It paints cortisol as a demon to be avoided at all costs, when actually cortisol is essential to maintain and improve fitness and, frankly, for human life. This week, I sat down with our favorite endocrinologist, Dr. Carla DiGirolamo, to dive in to what cortisol is, what it does, and how menopausal women can manage and, yes, even befriend it to optimize their health, performance, and well-being. I hope you enjoy this one as much as I did. Along with being a double board certified reproductive endocrinologist and OBGYN, specializing in infertility and menopausal medicine, Carla is also an endocrine consultant for Wild Health. She is a CrossFit Level 1 trainer, a certified nutrition coach, a member of CrossFit Health. She's a MedFit care provider, and she now provides weekly workouts and medical updates at her Substack, Athletic Aging. So I will put a link to all of that, her and her work, in the show notes so you can check it out. All right. Before we get to it, as always, check us out on Instagram and Facebook at Feisty Menopause. Sign up for my free weekly menopause blog at feistymenopause.com. While you're there, check out our Level Up Menopause membership, where we have experts like Carla come in and talk to us one-on-one. And also, our next Feisty Menopause Performance Retreat at Lake Nona, Florida is coming up. It is going to be November 16th through the 18th. We had such an amazing time at the last one, and I learned a ton from our movement analysis and all the other lectures. I think there's just a couple spots left in this one, so if you want to join me and the team in Florida, head on over to feistymenopause.com and nab a spot today. All right. Finally, quick thanks to Cool Jams for coming on as a sponsor. I have been sleeping in their ultra soft, super wicking shorty set, and I just love how cool they make me feel. I have always run hot and slept hot, even before this little journey through menopause, which turns up the furnace even higher. So I really appreciate them. Thanks, Cool Jams. You can check out their PJs and their sleep sets and get a discount with the show notes in our show. All right, enough of me. Let's have a few words about our awesome sponsors and get on with the show. Okay, Carla, welcome back to show number 4. I don't know. We're going to have to stop counting. We'll get you to 5 and I'll get you one of those fancy jackets like they do on Saturday Night Live.
I'll take that. I'll take a jacket. I'll take a feisty jacket.
There you go. Feisty jacket. So as we were talking about before I hit record, oh my Lord. We're watching this cortisol conversation happen, and I talk about it too. We talk about it in Next Level. It comes up a lot in the menopause space, but it feels like this is just taken on a life of its own, and the conversations around cortisol are kind of really intense, and sometimes I think intensely misdirected. So I'm gonna kick off this with your own words, because you did a whole blog, which we'll link in the show notes, about this. But you said you were talking about all the destructive narratives menopause, but we don't have time for all of them. He said the latest in these destructive narratives is the demonization of cortisol, a hormone necessary for human life. And this notion that midlife women should avoid physical intensity because, quote unquote, cortisol is bad is one of the most misguided and destructive narratives polluting our media outlets. Today's post is going to make a case against this narrative, and as will today's show. So let's set the record straight on this very villainized stress hormone. What is cortisol?
So cortisol is a steroid hormone, and what that means is that it is made from cholesterol, and it is in a family of hormones called glucocorticoids. And glucocorticoids are hormones that can decrease inflammation, regulate metabolism, various things like that. And it is produced by the adrenal gland and is one of the many hormones and other mediators of the stress response. And I want to stress that it is one of many. There are so many players in the stress hormone pathway, stress response pathway, that cortisol is just one of them. In the exercise I like to do to try to help people appreciate the complexity of these pathways is to, if you get on Google Images, and you type in stress response pathway, and you look at the images that come up, you'll be lucky. You'll have to look, like Where's Waldo and those old little magazines where they're like, oh, there's cortisol. Okay. And it's buried among so many other things because there's a lot going on in that response. And so part of the reason why cortisol gets a focus is because it is in one of the main pathways and it's measurable. It's very difficult to measure it. But a lot of times what we do is when we can measure something, we latch onto it and start to think that it's the be all to end all. But when you've got so many other players in the equation that maybe aren't so measurable, you lose sight of all the rest of the hormonal complexity that's happening, and that cortisol is just one player.
Yeah. And so let's talk about that. Like what is the female stress response? Like I've been taking your MedFit course, which does a brilliant job of explaining like the interplay of the HPA and the HPG axis. So talk about the stress response. Where does it come from and what is happening there? And then let's talk about what it looks like with female physiology specifically.
Sure. So where it starts is in the brain.
Okay.
The brain stem,
The hypothalamus.
and the hypothalamus, and the cortex, because something has to perceive the threat. So, I'm sitting out in my yard and I see a bear in the woods, or a coyote. We were just talking about coyotes this morning in my household. You see a coyote there, that is a threat. And that's the trigger of the stress response is the realization of a threat of some sort. It could be the coyote. It could be you walk into the CrossFit gym and you look at the whiteboard and say, oh shit, how the hell am I going to do this workout? And then you get that, visceral response. So it starts in the cortex and then it goes to the brainstem. And the brainstem and the hypothalamus, they coordinate the beginning of the hormone pathway. And so you have several hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, and then they communicate with the pituitary gland, produce a bunch of other hormones that then communicate with the adrenal glands to start producing cortisol, other things that regulate blood pressure, heart rate, respiration rate, because you got to be ready to address the threat. What also gets upregulated is certain immune response pathways, because you have to also be ready to get injured by the coyote, and the body's got to be ready to repair itself from injury and fight off infection and things like that, because that's why we have the stress responses for survival. And so the immune system gets ramped up, your cardiovascular system gets ramped up, your heart rate gets ramped up, your respiratory rate, everything. And your muscles start to get more blood flow to them. Your pain perception also goes down. So there is a whole system-wide upregulation that happens to help you respond to the threat. Cortisol is in that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that plays a role there. But there are other places too, like when we think about epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? They're not so much involved in that hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. They are actually in a family of hormones called catecholamines. They are neurotransmitters, which means that they act real fast because they're produced by nerve cells at the endings of nerve cells, so that they can send a message fast, right? So, like if you're driving on the PA Turnpike or the Mass Turnpike, and you have to stop really fast. You know how when you stop really fast, you get that surge and you feel it?
Yeah.
Well, that's what those hormones do, because some things in the pathway don't respond so instantaneously, other things do, and it's just a whole coordinated effort. So that's kind of a basic overview of what structures are important. It's basically perception in the brain, mediation through the hypothalamus, then it goes on to the pituitary, then goes to the adrenal glands, and then out through the whole rest of the body. That's basically what it is, and your whole body gets amped up to fight the threat.
That's so interesting. And it makes so much sense. Like it's, we always say in mountain biking anyway, adrenaline's a hell of a drug, because you can like crash your brains out and get right back on your bike and just continue on. And,
Yeah.
it's not until you're done that you're like, everything hurts, like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Athletic events and exercise are great models for the stress response. And there's been some good research out there. There's one paper that I have, it's in front and center in one of my folders on my computer, about how this research group used exercise as a model for the stress response and how they study it. So it's really pretty amazing how the same things happen whether you see a threat from a coyote, or whether you see as a threat from the event that you're in, the athletic event that you're doing.
So then what happens after we have fought or flown away from whatever after this has passed? Like, what has happened to the stress response at that point?
So what happens now is that things start to turn off, and the immune system actually starts to play a role in turning these things off. So there are also these feedback loops within the stress response, because it has to be able to turn on, but it's got to be able to turn off too, because one can't sustain over the long term the elevated blood pressure, elevated heart rate, elevated blood flow and everything else for a long time. And we'll talk about chronic stress in a little bit, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But so the body has to have a mechanism to turn it off, and the immune system tends to be that regulator. So there's perception that, okay, the threat has abated, things start to dial down. The immune system is now ramping up because it's trying to do all the cellular repair from, the upregulation that just happened, and it starts to turn things off. And then the parasympathetic nervous system gets activated. That's your rest and digest, that pathway. And that's what finally returns your heart rate to normal, returns your respiratory rate to normal, returns blood flow, and everything else becomes quiescent again and stable and in equilibrium.
So how is this maybe a little unique in the female physiology, as far as how that stress response interplays with the HPG axis?
So it's interesting. The stress response,
And maybe
not thinking.
explain what the HPG axis is. Sorry,
Yeah, that's okay. We'll talk about that too.
Yeah.
It's a similar. The HPA axis in men and women is similar. The way we respond to a threat is similar. There's differences, but very basically similar. But we have this menstrual cycle as females. Men don't have this. And this is probably one of the great departures, and one of the great differences, obviously, is that other hormonal pathway we call the HPG, which is hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. Men have a hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. Their gonads are the testicles, and they are involved in hormone pathways. But they don't have a menstrual cycle. So people aren't really aware of them until something goes wrong, until they have no sperm, or until something else happens. But in women, the HPG, the gonads being the ovaries, are what give us the menstrual cycle. And so what's interesting, and as I was, thinking about our chat today, what dawned on me is that it makes total sense that they talk to one another, because the mediators of the response live in the same place. So in the hypothalamus, you've got your hypothalamic hormones. That's cortisol releasing hormone. You have the gonadotropin releasing hormone that lives right in that same place. That's the initiator of the HPG. Then you go on down to the pituitary. The same hormones in the HPG axis live in the HPA, and the pituitary hormones are all living in the same place.
Yeah.
So when you have things in anatomical close proximity, it makes sense that they will talk to one another. And so what happens is when the HPA axis, this is the fight or flight response that we just talked about, what that does to amp up everything else, it dials down certain things. It dials down digestion, because you don't want to be digesting, veal parmesan when you're ready to fight the coyote. And it also turns off, or it dials down the menstrual cycle. Now, we see that effect when people have chronic stress, and this is prolonged stress where you never get back to that equilibrium. It has a direct negative effect on shutting off the menstrual cycle, because it makes perfect evolutionary sense. If there's a coyote in the woods ready to eat you, this is not time to be bearing babies.
Right.
This is conserved from the animal kingdom. So when there is stress around, this is not an ideal time to be diverting resources to a pregnancy and raising your babies, because there's stress. It's an inhospitable environment. So the HPA axis will shut the HPG axis down until equilibrium is established. Okay, it's safe to have babies again. We have enough fuel to support both ourselves and a pregnancy, and it's a tranquil environment to raise your young. So that's and it's huge, because not to be too dramatic, but I mean, the interplay of these two pathways is so powerful. I mean, it's why we exist as humans. It's how the human race perpetuates. It's survival and procreation all in the same thing. So it's incredibly powerful. So it's valuable for us as athletes and as women in general to learn to live within this very, very powerful pathway that nature has bestowed upon us, to be able to navigate through these times of our lives when, we are out of balance, or when we are adjusting to a new normal, like we are in menopause.
And let's talk about that. That's a good segue, because in the MedFit course, you mentioned that estrogen helps buffer this stress response. So how does that work? And is that the crux of where we start to get this tangent of women being worried about elevated cortisol and all the things that come with that, like the advice, like, don't exercise too hard because you're going to keep your cortisol too high? Like, where is estrogen fitting into this picture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that question. I'll be honest, I borrowed that expression from Stacy Sims, because when I was taking
Okay.
one of her courses, or reading Next Level, one or the other, and I read that for the first time, I'm like, oh my God, that is the best description of what's happening. And it's hard to put it into words. But I thought that Stacy did that beautifully when she referred to it this way. And so let's go back to what we were talking about. The stress response mediators live in similar places, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So we know they talk to each other. And there's lots of other evidence from other things that they talk to each other. So when we are having a normal menstrual cycle, when we're in our reproductive age of life and we're having regular menstrual cycles, there is a certain balance there. And because it is so closely related to the normal stress response pathway, they live in the same anatomical places. That is kind of keeping the stress response in check. It's the stress response saying, okay, are we okay? Yeah, we're having a normal menstrual cycle. We're all good. Everything is great. But what happens is that when the menstrual cycles become dysregulated, say in perimenopause, when we don't have them as often and when they're more chaotic, well, now the stress response is sitting there saying, okay, something's out of equilibrium, something's out of balance. So now there's trying to adjust to that. It's like, okay, the hormones are out of balance. That's causing all these physical effects. The stress response is saying, how do I fix this? Because I got to bring us back to equilibrium. Then, so there's an imbalance there. And so now if you put a stressor on top of that, your stress response has less reserve
Mm.
to deal with a new threat. It's dealing with the fact that it's all, that the menstrual cycles are out of whack and that's having certain physical effects. You lump stress onto that, like a big event or the coyote, it's going to take away, it's already expending resources trying to get the body back in equilibrium. You throw it even further out of equilibrium, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. So that's probably the best way that I can explain that, is that there is disequilibrium due to the changing hormones of perimenopause and menopause. The stress response is trying to find a way to bring the body back to equilibrium. So when you lump additional stress onto the whole equation, it makes it more difficult to deal with.
And so then we have what you might call like the unchecked stress response, right? Or like this chronically elevated, where it really, we don't want to demonize cortisol, but it really does look kind of demonic when you look at the excess glucose production and increased fat storage and the insulin resistance and the high blood pressure and the things that we see that are associated with this chronic stress response, correct?
It's a marker in
Okay.
some, it's a marker you can measure. It's not the sole marker. There's lots going on in the
Okay.
body, because you think about what's happening in perimenopause. We know that estrogen receptors live in nearly every tissue of the body. We also know that when the stress response gets amped up, it affects nearly every tissue of the body, the immune system, the skin, the sweat, everything. It affects everything. So it's not just watching cortisol that's the key. It's the rest of it. And what's happening during a chronic stress response, again, the stress pathways purpose is to bring the body back to equilibrium. It's to address the issue, taking it out of equilibrium, and then to bring it back.
Right.
So what you have to, the first thing the body needs to do is assess the threat, not assess the cortisol. And this is where I think people get very hung up, is that the threat's the problem. It's not the cortisol, it's the threat. And so what you have to do is figure out what is causing the stress. Is it low energy availability in red S? Is it my crappy marriage? Is it that I don't feel safe in my marriage? Maybe, I'm a victim of domestic violence. Maybe that's my chronic stressor. Maybe I have a job that I hate. Maybe I have an anxiety disorder or some other mood disorder. So what you have to do is look at that and say, okay, what are my stressors? What is it that's driving my stress response? And try to deal with that. And the cortisol is a marker. It's just one piece of a puzzle, because well, say it's LEA. Let's just use LEA because there's other markers of LEA as well. You've got your ferritin, you've got your CRP, you've got anemia. Say you use those three things. So what you may do is say, okay, I'm going to address the LEA. So you have an athlete, they're fueling better, they're resting more, they're getting, they're getting the recovery that they need, their performance is improving, maybe their menstrual cycles came back, but their cortisol is still high. Are we going to panic because the cortisol isn't falling in line? Maybe there's some other reason. Maybe the cortisol might be falling in line, but maybe it's not quite where one would expect it to be. But at the end of the day, when you look at the whole picture, that athlete's doing a whole hell of a lot better. So you don't want to then throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh, I'm not doing enough because my cortisol is not right. Well, no, the whole organism is right because you address the threat. And the body tends to have compensatory mechanisms to bring itself back to equilibrium. So cortisol can be a tool, but it's just one small tool in the other armamentarium of stuff that we have. So it's not the be all to end all. It's not, it's not wrong to check it. It's not wrong to follow it, but you have to take it for what it is. It's one small piece of an extremely big puzzle.
And where does exercise specifically fit into this, right? I mean, we have exercise that certainly activates the sympathetic nervous system, right? We've talked about this to trigger the cortisol response. Like, there's been really interesting studies on endurance athletes where they look at their hair and they have like more cortisol, elevated cortisol hair concentrations, for whatever. I mean, I'm sure when you're out there for 12 hours doing something that's pretty stressful. Where does exercise fit in, and why are people sort of honing in and worried about that being the cortisol problem and keeping it
Well,
elevated?
here's the thing, and here's the dilemma.
Okay.
So especially in midlife,
All
right?
right. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, in midlife, it's a very catabolic time of our lives. We are losing muscle mass, we are losing bone mass, we are losing power. Because that's what happens when your estrogen receptors go down, and when your estrogen levels go down, these are the changes that start to happen. Metabolism's changing because of the relative insulin resistance. So that's what's happening in the body. To prevent that, you need to exercise, because if you don't exercise, those declines are going to keep happening at a very rapid pace. So to mitigate those things, and these things, the bone loss, the muscle loss, the cardiovascular decline, that's the stuff that's going to kill you eventually. So you have to mitigate that. And the only way to mitigate that is by exercise, and not just walking. Just walking isn't going to help the triathlete or the power lifter to maintain that level of fitness and to stave off the decline. Walking helps for the sedentary person who doesn't do it. That's a step in the right direction. I'm not demonizing walking. I think it's great, but you have to think about, okay, well, what type of exercise am I capable of doing? So you need to do the exercise to maintain and to become fitter. In order to exercise to an extent to maintain or become fitter, your cortisol and your stress response needs to be involved. So the problem isn't that we're doing too much exercise. Well, maybe, you might be out of balance, but just for the sake of the conversation, you need to do the exercise to get fitter, to stave off the other things that are declining. To do that exercise, you need your stress response to be activated. But what the focus needs to be on is the recovery and bringing the response back to equilibrium. That's where the focus is, not to eliminate the exercise, because if you eliminate the exercise, the rest of your health parameters are going to go downhill fast. But what you need to do is say, okay, I need to jack up my cortisol to get fitter, but I need to bring it back down. And I need to recover better. I need to fuel appropriately. I need not to overtrain. I need to do enough tissue care, get the sleep. So that's where the focus needs to be, not doing the exercise.
I would love you to say that louder for the people in the back, but I think we've got it. And I want to, this dovetails really nicely with something that I talk about a lot in the show. We certainly talk about it in Next Level. Like, a lot of what we talk about in this space is picking up some of the slack that your hormones used to help your body do naturally, right? Like, that's a lot of what we talk about when we talk about lifting heavy, when we talk about all this stuff. Like, your hormones used to just help you maintain your muscle and your bone naturally. Now you need to do a little more to help your body because they're just not there at the same level. And what I'm hearing you say is that maybe you used to be able to get away and your stress response would normalize more a bit on its own, but now that's not happening. So it becomes increasingly important not to say goodbye to the hard stuff that you were doing, but to say more hello to like all the stuff that you might have blown off before, whether that's a cool down or mobility work or days off or that kind of thing. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely, 100%. I know for myself, sometimes my warm-ups last longer than my workouts. I mean, I'm a CrossFitter. Our workouts tend to be, short and spicy. But I spend now, I'll be 53 next week. I spend more time now warming up and cooling down than the workout itself. And I thank God I do it, because it makes a huge difference. Because if I go into a workout cold, I'll pull a muscle, I'll get injured, and, it's not worth it. But your body changes. I'm menopausal now. My body has changed, and so I've had to figure out through a lot of trial and error, what do I need to do? And one of the things I personally need to do is warm up more and cool down more. The other thing I need to do is a lot more yoga, mobility work, and mindfulness stuff. Because not only am I a CrossFit athlete recreationally, but I've got this day job called Boston IVF, and my medical practice and everything I'm doing. So my psychological stress is through the roof, and so I have to manage that. Not to mention all the physical changes just because of where I am in my life. So I've had to totally turn upside down and start from scratch, saying, okay, here's where I am. And what do I need now? What's working and what's not working? And taking that inventory, which starts with what are my stressors, is really the most valuable thing that you can do.
And it seems to me that we are all very, very good at activating our sympathetic nervous system, but maybe we're not as good at activating our parasympathetic system, right? So like it behooves us, and that's what I'm hearing you say at this time, to learn all those techniques, whether it be the breathing exercises, the yoga, the mindfulness. I know that's what like cold plunge is all the rage because of, the vagus nerve. But there could be something to it when you need more help getting to that state, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think tissue care is a very important thing that a lot of times people neglect. We're all strapped for time. And
Define
what's
tissue
the
care for us.
tissue care, like foam rolling, something
Mm.
simple like foam rolling, massage, body work, things like that. um it could be sauna, could be a cold plunge, because that's affecting your tissues as well. So anything that is helping your tissues to recover. An active recovery day is tissue care as well, because you're still moving but you're not moving. So taking care of those things is super super important, and it's the first thing to go, because when we're all strapped for time, it's like, all right, I got 30 minutes to get my trail or my hill running in. Well, am I going to meditate beforehand? I'm not sure if I can do the 10-minute meditation afterwards. And I am guilty of it myself, all the time. I have to really commit to saying, okay, I got to give myself 45 minutes. I can't just get this in 30 minutes. I got to give myself 45 minutes because I have to warm up. I have to cool down. It's a priority. And if I can't do those things, maybe I have to cut the run short. And then, of course, no, you don't want to do that. So it's really prioritizing it. You got to do it, because your body will thank you.
Yeah, that's a excellent point. And I definitely started doing that. Like it was my treat when I had those long, hard swims leading up to this half Ironman I did. There's a jacuzzi, between the pool and the locker room. And I'd be like, I am just going to do my workout and I'm going to treat myself by going in, and you can set it for 2 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever. I'm like, at least 2 minutes. And as soon as I would step into that water, it was like I melted. It was just like I could just feel everything just go, "Oof," and I would sleep really well. And I'm like, there's definitely something to this, like taking that 2 minutes just to bring it all down had such profound effects on my mental state. It was unbelievable.
It is, and how little time you need. To your point, you were just saying 2 minutes. One of the things my coach told me to do, and this was during a time where I felt like I was drowning. I was just going through stuff. I just really did not feel like I had good control over getting my stress response back to baseline. It was affecting me physically. She said, Carla, look, take 3 minutes before your workout and do breath work in 3 minutes after. It's 3 minutes. That's all you need to do. It will make a huge difference. And oh my God, I was laughing. I'm like, 3 minutes? I need like a half a day doing that with the stuff that I'm going through right now. And she said, nope, just do 3 minutes before and after. Stick with it. Do it for 2 weeks. Tell me how you feel afterwards. And I was blown away by what my whoop strap was telling me. My HRV went up through the roof. I was sleeping better. I'm like, damn, there's really something to this.
100%. And I am super guilty of not warming up enough. Like that's my thing. And my coach was very adamant about like taking that time. So I would take three, and it was 3 minutes, and it makes such a huge difference. And whenever you want to minimize what 3 minutes is, I mean, you can put it in context of 3 minutes is a boxing match, like that's a long time. 3 minutes, like try doing 3 minutes of burpees. Like 3 minutes is
Right.
actually a long time,
It is,
so
it's real time.
yeah, it's gonna have if it's yeah, I mean, we do tend to like, it's funny how we'll just blow off that number when it's one thing, and then we'll appreciate the gravity of it when it's another. But if you do something mindfully for 3 minutes, it is quite it's enough time to make an impact.
Yeah, and with breath work, and they say this in Ayurvedic medicine, though
Mm.
it originates in India, I think. They're all about the breath and the magic of the breath, and how the this response system is linked to the breath. And dealing with anxiety too, that is something that's a tool that people use. I have an issue with flying, and so what
Mm.
I was told by some experts was that you need to slow your breathing down, because if you slow your breathing down, it's going to tell your brain, the plane's not crashing, everything's fine. And the stress response listens to the breath. So I think breath work is very powerful because it is linked directly to the stress response system.
Yeah, yeah. I had a fascinating show with Jill Miller, who does a whole huge, very big, heavy book, Body